A large crowd of people is completely taken aback by how you managed this despicable situation and preserved your dignity. This isn't because you evaded the chaotic conflict, but because you walked directly into the heart of it and somehow managed to keep from getting dragged down into the mess. You never lost your composure when they targeted you with their quiet rumors and their organized, petty attacks. You definitely didn't grant them the joy of seeing you break down under the pressure of what they were attempting to accomplish, what they were really aiming to do. They possessed a strategic blueprint. You see, it was a deeply detailed, cruel scheme, crafted to strip away every bit of trust and respect you had spent years earning. The reality concerning plots like that is that they succeed best when the intended target has no idea they are coming. Only, you actually did know. You weren't acting out of paranoia, and you weren't constantly scanning for danger in a way that burns out your nervous system, but rather in a calm, subtle manner. It felt like a low, aching sensation in your chest that you couldn't quite label until one day, out of nowhere, you looked at all the evidence and finally recognized the overall pattern. You saw everything they had been putting together. What you chose to do next is what truly amazes people. You didn't put up defensive walls. You didn't turn cold, harsh, or overly protective of yourself. You didn't start gathering evidence inside a folder or practicing speeches in front of a mirror about how wrong they were, how right you were, and how everyone would eventually see the truth if you could just construct the perfect argument or convince them of your side. Instead, you did something that seemed, from an outside perspective, almost suspiciously like nothing at all. It was as if you just kept living your life. You continued to show up. You replied to your emails. You brewed your morning coffee. You engaged in conversations with people who, as you now realize, were likely being fed subtle lies about you by individuals who decided your presence was inconvenient. You smiled and laughed when it was natural to do so. You asked someone how their sick pet was doing. You remembered a friend's birthday, all while the people trying to tear you down were eagerly waiting for your inevitable breakdown. They were watching for a tear in your armor. They waited for the exact moment you would lose your cool and give them the exact excuse they needed to label you as unstable, irrational, and overly emotional. Exactly. They wanted to prove you weren't someone to be taken seriously. That was their ultimate goal. However, that dramatic breakdown never actually occurred. That detail, more than anything else, is what left the crowd completely speechless, because they had seen this scenario play out before. They recognized the focused smear effort, the gradual destruction of someone's name, and the way a person can be driven to look crazy simply by being pushed past their breaking point repeatedly in front of witnesses. They know how that narrative typically finishes. They have witnessed it happen 100 times, likely took part in versions of it themselves, or perhaps were even on the receiving end of it once or twice. They know the entire storyline, yet you refused to follow that script. Instead, you took an approach that was far more unexpected and powerful. Yes, completely unexpected. You paid attention without letting it become an obsession. You recognized the scheme without allowing it to dominate your entire perspective. You experienced the pain of being double-crossed, along with the disorienting shock of realizing that people you trusted were involved in something toxic. You allowed yourself to feel that pain deeply, in your core, in your chest, and behind your eyes. And then you simply kept moving forward. I know it sounds simple, not because you're some emotionless robot who doesn't feel human pain, but because you recognized on a fundamental level that responding to aggression with more aggression would only confirm the story they were trying to spread about you. They desperately wanted you to transform into the monster they claimed you were, and you simply refused to play along. So you sat quietly with your discomfort. Instead, you allowed yourself the internal space to feel anger, betrayal, confusion, and pain. All of it. You didn't rush to fix those emotions or hide them away. You simply let them exist while you carried on with your day-to-day life, continuing to show up and remaining the person you have always been. You stayed the reliable individual, the steady anchor, the person who keeps the big picture in mind and refuses to get pulled into childish drama. Here is the reality of taking that path. It completely throws off people who are fishing for an emotional reaction. It actually unnerves them. They kept pushing your buttons, testing your limits, and inserting subtle traps into your path. Yet you kept moving forward as if their coordinated attacks on your character were nothing more than temporary bad weather passing through. That is the moment the larger group began to pay attention. It wasn't just because you stayed intact, but because you somehow managed to maintain your generosity throughout the ordeal. You still acknowledged others' hard work when it was deserved. You continued to offer a helping hand to people who, as it turned out, were actively plotting against you. You still found room in your heart to be kind, even to those who didn't deserve your grace, because you understood that your own actions were the only thing you could truly control. You refused to let their toxicity change who you are at your core. That is the specific detail that truly grips people. Surviving a smear campaign while keeping your self-respect intact is one achievement. Coming out on the other side with your warmth fully intact, still genuinely liking people and remaining open to trusting others, is something else entirely. You managed to build a safe haven within your own mind, a peaceful sanctuary that no amount of outside drama could destroy, while your opponents were running around in a panic, trying to spin the story, damage control the narrative, and hide their own tracks. You were cultivating inner peace. This wasn't the kind of peace that comes from ignoring reality or burying your feelings, but the kind rooted in deep self-awareness. It is the capability to observe your own emotional distress without letting it hijack your actions. You could feel frustration building up, along with the strong urge to defend your name, set the record straight, and explain your side to anyone willing to listen. Yet you chose a different path. You chose to pause, take a breath, and evaluate what was actually necessary in that moment, rather than acting on what your wounded ego was demanding. The broader group witnessed this unfold live. They watched you interact with the very individuals who were actively trying to destroy your life, and they observed you staying composed, fair, and level-headed. They saw you give people the benefit of the doubt, even when you had every reason to be guarded and suspicious. They watched you diffuse tense situations effortlessly, simply by refusing to match the chaotic energy of those attempting to provoke you. It is a quiet strength that might go unnoticed initially, but it becomes glaringly obvious when contrasted with the alternative. The alternative is constant defensiveness, an obsessive need to be right, and a desperate monitoring of who said what, who is taking whose side, and what everyone thinks about you. You surrendered all of that emotional baggage, letting it drift away while remaining grounded in your core values. You also demonstrated an unwavering confidence in your own lived experience. Absolute confidence. You didn't rely on them to validate your reality. You didn't need their approval to know what you experienced. You trusted your gut, relied on what you saw and felt, and didn't feel compelled to argue every minor detail to every person you met. You held on to your truth gently, secure in the knowledge that it remained true, regardless of whether anyone else acknowledged it. That mindset is remarkably liberating. However, it is also exceptionally rare. When most people face misrepresentation or lies, they feel a desperate urge to correct the story, present proof, and force everyone to see the real facts. You, on the other hand, seem to realize that debating people who are committed to misunderstanding you is a complete drain on your time and energy. You realize that your primary audience wasn't the group that had already turned against you, but the onlookers who were still watching, assessing, and forming their own judgments. Those neutral observers, the larger crowd, were watching every move closely. They saw you decline to act like a helpless victim, even though you had every right to claim that status. They saw you reject the victim narrative, even when the situation practically invited you to adopt it. They watched you absorb the painful experience and integrate it into your worldview without letting it corrupt you into a bitter, mistrustful person. That transformation is truly incredible to observe, because the kind of relentless, coordinated effort to destroy your reputation would have crushed most people. Trust me, most individuals break under that kind of weight. It isn't because they are weak, but because enduring that level of organized hostility is mentally and emotionally exhausting. Yet, you didn't just endure it. You actually grew through it. You expanded your capacity for patience, wisdom, and grace. You gained clarity on who was genuinely trustworthy, who was just a fair-weather friend, and who had actively chosen to participate in your downfall. Crucially, you didn't waste the next several months plotting revenge. You simply took in the reality of the situation and adjusted your life accordingly. The crowd took note of your boundaries. These weren't aggressive or defensive walls, but quiet, firm boundaries. They communicated a clear message. I am open to genuine connection, but I am completely unavailable for disrespect. You stopped over-explaining your choices. You stopped trying to prove your value to people who had already made up their minds to ignore it. You quietly removed your energy from toxic environments, not with loud arguments or dramatic exits, but with the quiet confidence of someone who simply values their time. Those better uses of your time were things that truly nourished your soul, taking care of your well-being, pouring into relationships that were mutually supportive, and continuing to build a life that felt authentic and fulfilling. The crowd also couldn't help but notice the sharp contrast between your conduct and the behavior of those attacking you. The difference was impossible to miss. While you remained centered and calm, your attackers grew increasingly desperate and unstable. The more you ignored their provocations, the harder they tried to get a reaction out of you. The more they escalated, the more unreasonable and unhinged they appeared to everyone else. The broader group, which might have initially been open to hearing out their original grievances, began to see the situation for what it truly was: a calculated smear campaign targeting someone who was simply a convenient target for someone else's personal issues. The public perception shifted because you provided the space for people to see the truth clearly, without the distraction of defensive arguments, counterattacks, or emotional drama that would have clouded their judgment. On top of all that, you managed to do this while simultaneously working on your goals, whether that was advancing your career, nurturing a community, creating work, supporting a family, or deepening your personal growth. You kept investing in your future. You refused to let this conflict consume your entire identity. You didn't allow your mistreatment to become the central focus of your life. You acknowledged the hardship, honored your feelings, and used the lesson to guide your choices going forward, but you never stopped living. That persistence was the most powerful statement you could have made. The individuals who wanted to see you fail were forced to watch you not only survive the ordeal, but actually flourish. You continued to show up as your authentic self, still creative, still caring toward others, and still fully capable of experiencing joy, humor, and meaningful connections. The larger group remains amazed because they have been in environments before where someone's character was being picked apart, where their decisions were being criticized, and where their reputation was under fire. They know what typically happens in those moments. They have seen people become defensive and bitter, getting so wrapped up in defending their image that they stop acting like a human being and turn into an endless debate case. Yes, exactly like that. They have watched people get so consumed by self-defense that they sacrifice everything that actually matters: their relationships, their values, and above all, their peace of mind. You did the exact opposite. You remained firm in your identity. You were honest about your own flaws and mistakes. You never claimed to be perfect, but you also refused to let anyone else dictate your worth. That distinction is massive. You refused to shrink down to satisfy your critics, and you also refused to inflate your ego into something arrogant and untouchable. You simply stayed grounded and human. In an environment where everyone else was acting either inferior or superior, your simple humanity was the most disarming quality of all. There is a sense that you had navigated similar emotional terrain before. Perhaps not this exact scenario, but you were familiar with the underlying feelings. You had done enough self-reflection, learned enough from past mistakes, and accumulated enough life experience that when this attack occurred, you weren't caught completely unprepared. You had mental tools. You had a solid perspective. You possessed a strong inner relationship with yourself that could endure external attacks without falling apart. That kind of strength isn't random luck. It is the product of sustained personal growth. You had spent years cultivating that inner foundation, perhaps without even realizing it, simply by choosing maturity over defensiveness, self-reflection over self-justification, and real connection over the cheap victory of winning an argument. The observing crowd could sense that deep-rooted maturity. They could tell you weren't just putting on a show or acting composed for public approval. There was real substance beneath your actions, a genuine acceptance of your own humanity that enabled you to extend grace to others, even to those who were actively causing you harm. That doesn't mean you excused their bad behavior or minimized the hurt they caused. You simply reached a point where you no longer required them to change in order for you to be okay. Their toxic behavior was their burden, not yours. It didn't define who you were. That sense of liberation from needing external validation was unmistakable. It gave you a quiet magnetism that drew people in. They felt safe and grounded around you, confident that things would turn out fine because you were handling the storm so well, having already endured the hardest parts while remaining standing. You are still standing strong. So when the chaos finally died down and the desperate smear campaign ran out of steam, as it inevitably was bound to do, and the people who tried to ruin you were left surrounded by the mess of their own making, the crowd didn't see a victim who barely survived. They saw someone who went through a trial by fire and came out stronger and more refined. They saw someone who recognized that true power isn't about controlling others, but about refusing to let others break your spirit. They saw someone capable of navigating complex emotions, someone who could experience deep anger, yet still choose to act with kindness, and someone who could recognize betrayal without closing their heart to future trust. They saw an imperfect human who made no false claims, but whose core values were so steady that they proved undeniable. Saving face isn't about putting on a fake show to look good. It is about understanding that your reputation is built on your actual conduct, not on other people's gossip. You preserved your dignity by staying true to yourself when everyone else was pressuring you to put on an act. You protected your integrity by following through on your commitments, keeping your promises, and treating others with respect, even when that respect wasn't returned. Absolutely. You saved face by refusing to become the bitter person they claimed you were. You saved face by showing up authentically and unapologetically, letting people draw their own logical conclusions. As it turned out, those conclusions were entirely different from what your detractors had hoped. What truly impresses the crowd is your quiet stability, your refusal to be thrown off balance, and your deep self-respect that doesn't demand external proof. It is your capability to feel your pain without using it as a weapon against others or as an excuse to hide. It is your willingness to move forward with wisdom, acknowledging the past without being trapped by it. They are truly amazed in a culture that constantly feeds on outrage and quick reactions. You chose a far more challenging and rare path. You chose mindful presence. You chose to stay grounded in the present moment, doing your work and remaining true to yourself, without engaging in the desperate control tactics that usually accompany conflict like this. That steady, patient, and grounded presence ultimately proved to be the most influential force in the room. Indeed, the most powerful quality possible. Here is the fundamental truth that everyone now sees clearly. You were never in real danger of losing your identity. You were never going to turn into the false persona they tried to project onto you, because that version of you was completely fabricated. You know who you are. You know your identity not in a stubborn or defensive way, but in a resilient, grounded, and adaptable way. You know your core principles. You know what truly matters to you. You understand that outside circumstances, no matter how chaotic, do not have the power to alter your core character. External events can cause inconvenience, pain, and complication, but they cannot destroy your fundamental self. That inner resilience is what makes you truly formidable. That is what leaves observers in awe. They have encountered strong individuals before. They have seen resilient people. However, they have rarely witnessed someone absorb a relentless, organized attempt to tear them down and emerge with their core character not only intact, but noticeably strengthened. Strengthened and transformed. Strengthened is definitely the better term. Now, whenever you enter a room, people perceive you differently. They look at you with a new level of respect. They recognize your depth, appreciate what you have endured, and hold a profound respect for you that didn't exist before. It isn't pity. There is no pity in their respect, nor is there any sense of superiority. There is simply genuine recognition. It is the recognition that you are someone who can be counted on, not just to show up, but to remain grounded under intense pressure. It is the realization that your stability is a comforting anchor that others can rely on when things become chaotic. It is the recognition that you have earned a quiet strength through your hardships that cannot be taken away or shaken, an authentic authority that comes from being tested and standing firm. Meanwhile, you are simply continuing to live your life. You haven't grown arrogant or bitter about the journey. You aren't walking around holding a grudge or boasting about your survival. You are simply present, accessible, and still appreciative of the beauty in the world, despite having witnessed its darker sides. You remain fully capable of experiencing joy, open to building real connections, and fundamentally hopeful. It isn't out of naivety, but because you have deliberately chosen hope over cynicism, fully aware of everything that could have made you bitter. It isn't naive at all. More than anything else, that deliberate choice to stay hopeful and grounded is what is truly remarkable. It is genuinely inspiring.